Hi, and welcome to Blue Square Security, hosted by the Microsoft Digital Security Specialist Team, a podcast dedicated to cybersecurity with guests from all over the industry, both inside and outside Microsoft, to bring you as many perspectives as possible.
I don't believe you can do insider risk without DLP, and I don't believe you can do DLP without insider risk or insider threat, right? I think that function has to consider everything. So that's.
Welcome back to Blue Square Security. That was a quick section of our conversation with Lighthouse, and the conversation was around DLP and insider risk. This was an episode I wasn't sure is going to have that pizzazz, considering we've talked a little bit about AI and some other exciting cloud technologies. But this episode ended up being, in my opinion, one of the better ones. It was a very insightful conversation. I learned a lot about both technologies, and I hope that you do too. Again, thanks so much for tuning in and enjoy the episode. All right, thank you guys for tuning in for another episode of Blue Square Security. We are privileged to be joined by one of our award-winning partners this afternoon, Lighthouse. We've got two colleagues, one from across the pond and one from the West Coast. We've got both Chris and Amren from Lighthouse, so I will let them go through and introduce themselves.
Thank you, Greg. Thanks, Michael. Guys, just firstly, big thank you for having us on the podcast. Really excited to have the conversation with you guys today. I think we'll just do some personal intros first for people who are listening to this that can't see us, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about who Lighthouse is. So I'll go first. I'm Chris Baird. I'm a senior security consultant in Lighthouse. I work in the UK. I'm the guy who's across the pond, but we're a global organization, so I do have a lot of projects in Europe, but a lot of my clients tend to be global based. So I work primarily in the security compliance technologies across Purview. So that's things like Microsoft Information Protection, data classification, DLP, insider risk management. I think we're going to chat a lot about those conversations today, about those technologies today, guys. My background, I sort of 25 years freelance consultant. A lot of the clients that I've had in the past, I have similar clients now with Lighthouse, which is great, reconnecting with some old clients. I performed architecture roles in the past, security lead roles as well, largely on the other side. So a consultant inside the organization. So I'm able to kind of see the challenges that they have directly, as opposed to somebody that's kind of coming at this from a consultancy, which is always kind of useful for me. But yeah, just kind of really love my role, really enjoy working for Lighthouse. Reconnecting with Microsoft has been great as well. Worked extensively with you guys over the last sort of 12 months, which has been really, really great. And I'll pass over to Amren to say hello as well.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So yeah, excited to be here as well, guys. Thanks for having us. So my name's Amren. I sound like Chris. I'm from the UK, but I'm also situated on the West Coast. So my role is very similar to Chris's on the US side. So very much involved with the Microsoft Purview technology stack, helping clients operationalize the data protection technologies. So MIP, DLP, insider risk management. My background is actually in digital forensics and e-discovery. But I made the shift to security, and now my focus is very much on those technologies and helping clients make the use of their purchase of that M365 technology and helping guide through build those frameworks for that technology as well. So yeah, excited to talk with you guys today.
Perfect. Now we appreciate you guys taking the time today, and like we were talking before we hit record here, this is a conversation that's going to be kind of focused on the Purview offering, the security kind of 35,000 foot view, but honing into Amren, what you just discussed was the DLP, the insider risk, and for somebody that's just listening, you hear somebody talk about, well, we're going to have a 35 or 40-minute conversation around compliance, or a 35-minute conversation around DLP. That doesn't keep you up at night. That doesn't get you excited. It's not one of the most exciting technologies that are out there. But I say that because the evolution of protecting data has gone so far, where it used to be just the endpoint component, and now we're looking at doing this in the cloud. And both of you have, Chris, you mentioned you've got global customers. When I hear somebody say that they've got a focus on data management or data protection, and they're managing global customers, compliance seems like a very frightening role to be kind of in charge of, or your day to day. You've got so many different entities and things change from country to country, from time zone to time zone. What is the one thing that you might be able to see from a trend talking to global accounts as it relates to compliance? Or is there one kind of trend that you've noticed over the years?
I think, Greg, you kind of hit the nail right. I mean, it doesn't sound like the most exciting stack of technologies, but believe me, when people scramble around, there is a data leak. It is pretty exciting. They won't call it exciting, but there's kind of panic and chaos if you don't have the controls in place, right? I think one of the big things for me, kind of over the last sort of 10 years, is that move to zero trust framework. So moving the perimeter, getting organizations to accept the traditional firewall is kind of it's not a thing of the past, right? But we're doing things in different ways. The way you described, multiple connected cloud applications hosted in many different geographies. So you've now got data in not only different physical locations, but different data jurisdictions. So what we tend to get with Lighthouse, we've got a significant number of consultants with different experience. Many of those guys have very different experience to Amren. So we've got privacy guys, we've got e-discovery. We're also a law firm primarily, right? Our background is ESI. That's kind of where we came from. So we really kind of get a lot of the challenges around, we could be having a conversation about endpoint protection and DLP where we talk about the telemetry. Such a simple thing, right? To think about device telemetry. But that's data that's having to leave a region. It's having to go to a different jurisdiction. That could create a privacy concern. So for us, it's kind of giving clients that full visibility, being able to give them the ability to kind of measure their compliance risk and compliance posture with kind of that top level view down of privacy, data protection, data leakage, kind of connecting that back to a company's risk appetite and really kind of helping them. But I think zero trust is possibly the one, Craig, that stands out for me. That's kind of the big move over the last few years, that it's all about validate that user, know your identity, understand who it is, and provide those protected controls that kind of move with the data and follow the data.
Yeah, and I would add to that in saying, the shift of the last few years has been maybe traditionally what people would see as more of like a technology-centric approach, where people would have your people in charge would want to bring in the best of breed technologies and say they want to use the different platforms for different experiences and different solutions, but shifting away from that technology-centric approach to a more information-centric approach, where people understand that these Microsoft shops have all of their data within this huge warehouse of information. It's not about what technologies can we throw at the technology to protect it. It's what are the requirements from an information standpoint. Then saying, okay, these are the technologies we need to adhere to our requirements or data handling policies. I think particularly with the Microsoft technologies over the past few years is that as people realize that, okay, there are specific technologies that you can only protect with Microsoft technologies, there are gaps in using that kind of best of breed approach. And you identify those gaps when you say, okay, this is, for example, performing a privacy assessment of where your data is across your landscape. It presents those gaps. Whereas if you're a Microsoft shop, using those Microsoft technologies generally is built to cover all of the gaps of where that information is within Microsoft, right? So I think that shift from using every best of breed what's considered best of breed technology and using the technology in conjunction with each other on technology that's specifically built for where the data is residing itself has been a big shift as well.
That's such an interesting point, because when I hear the conversation going towards best of breed, I gravitate towards the SIM/SOAR type of conversation, and the start stop gap that is presented when you're implementing a best of breed approach is something, at least in security, that I think is overlooked. They all have a very pointed purpose. If it's email protection or cloud gateway protection, they all have a very specific role to play in the overall network. But the one thing that, and I've been on the networking side and I've sold into accounts talking about why this is the best of breed approach. I guess I'm part of the problem when you think about it that way. But what is quickly glanced over is getting these variety of technologies, these variety of vendors to speak to one another is not an easy feat. And then when you look at the platform that Microsoft puts at the table, I think the number that we've got, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's 65 or 75 trillion unique security signals on a daily basis. And that is then funneled down to every part of the network. And that gives them real-time updates as far as 0 days and, maybe if it goes down to one of the mobile devices. So you're getting cross-platform connectivity and cross-platform data being shared. And I had not really made that jump or that connection into the DLP world or the data sensitivity world or the compliance world, but it's just as an applicable conversation as Amren, you just pointed out. It's just odd that gets glossed over time and time again. Michael, I know you had 4 or 5 kind of queued up questions. Why don't you start with question number 1 there?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, right, Microsoft, we're talking about all 3 of the solutions Microsoft kind of looks at from a data security perspective. When you guys are out dealing with customers, whether it's in the UK, here in the US, what are kind of those steps that you take with clients to start to look at, is my data protected all the way across the environment?
That's a good. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Amren, my apologies, but I think it's a great question, and there's so many different answers to it, right, Michael? Because I think many organizations may adopt. It could be driven by licensing initially, right? One of our engagements may be driven by licensing. A client may consider, for example, buying an E5 license to get access to eDiscovery Premium, right? So to get the E5 compliance add-on. What many of the clients don't realize is how to maximize the investment on that E5 licensing, right? So part of our business is to go in and help those clients with that adoption and really kind of maximize. So we're then raising risks to clients, having discussions about where is your data? Do you understand this as a risk? And we have a product that kind of we put together that helps us do that. It's an environment scan that we can perform for clients when we go in and use all the Microsoft technologies to give visibility of where the key risks are within their estate. But equally, we get inquiries from clients who've had a ransomware attack last year, that kind of thing, and they've had 300 gig of data just leaked with customer data drops online. They want to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen again, right? And they start exploring the kind of anti-malware, EDR, XDR, and that kind of avenue, but they tend to neglect protecting the information itself as a data asset. So a lot of these organizations don't necessarily have mature data governance as well, right? So they may not have a data catalog, visibility across the state of exactly where the data is. So the first kind of things we tend to do is start to do analysis on what does a business look like? What do the business functions look like? And what's key to those functions? And Amren, I'll let you talk to that because you do a really good job, kind of the workshops of driving that out. And then we start to talk to those functions about what is your data? What does it look like? What are the key risks around that data and key use cases? Because what I think where DLP falls flat is if you drive it purely from a policy direction without appreciating the information risk, you just end up with a complex list of DLP policies that you've got false positives all across your estate and so on. So we kind of really want to drive the deep dive conversation into understanding what the data is. But Amren, I'll let you maybe talk.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Our starting point is obviously it's from a very educational standpoint, is okay, assessing where they're at from a maturity standpoint, because we get a full spectrum, like some people have no idea about technology, how it's used, and others are very sophisticated in their knowledge. But understanding how the tool works, individually is one thing, but really to maximize the benefit, it's using the tools in conjunction with one another is how you maximize the benefit. So we like to tell a story. There's a natural flow to how you use the technology, right? So everything starts with that data identification piece, with data classification, right? So people will often say, we want to deploy DLP, let's jump straight into, let's start building some policies. These are the things that we want to target. And we're like, hold on a minute, take a step back. There are at least 2 or 3 technologies that we should start to look at first, or at least even look to implement first before we get to DLP, because obviously without the identification piece, you don't know what data that you're trying to prevent exfiltration of, for example, right? So we really try to educate users in deploying our clients to educate them on deploying the technology in the right order, as well as understanding what the prerequisites, what's the technology kind of under the hood to then maximize the benefit of DLP, for example.
And Chris, you mentioned you've got some global customers, and Amren, you said you've got a very similar role here in the U.S. That leads me to believe you guys deal, I don't want to say exclusively, but is it predominantly with the enterprise size customers?
Yeah, we tend to deal with kind of anything from sort of 1,000 seat up is kind of the ballpark, right? But many of our clients are sort of 100, 150,000 seats as well. So we do go right up to that kind of true global. Those businesses are particularly of interest when it comes to their kind of mergers and acquisitions. You've got companies coming into organizations with new data, with new processes, new people, trying to connect that data to an existing organization's information framework is really tricky as well, right? So those global organizations have that extra paradigm that we need to dive into. But yeah, I mean, Amren, maybe some of the clients we deal with in the US, sort of size and scale, you might have experience. Sort of the smaller clients. Well, maybe.
Yeah, certainly enterprise level. I do want to touch on that often as well. Chris mentioned that we do is like the environment scans. Really, generally, what we tend to do is we like to go in and educate the client on their own environment, right? So we have a pretty boxed offering. It's like a low lift, high value offering where we go in and run a series of PowerShell scripts that create discovery searches and export a ton of information about the client's environment. I think generally people see, okay, we're embarking on a data protection initiative. We need to bring security in, and we need to bring certain teams. What they don't realize is that it's actually an effort across the board. So we'll bring in privacy teams and the information governance teams and the legal teams, and this surfaces there's so much information around. There's overlap between, for example, retaining and deleting data and how much risk is associated with retaining like secret holds or unknown holds, or just not disposing of stale data which is likely going to contain sensitive content. That's kind of seen as like an information governance practice is for retention and deletion, was that creates a significant risk for security, right, in terms of that stale data still residing there. So that's one of the things that those environment scans really surface, like an insight into the client's organization. That's typically our starting point. But yeah, just pulling the various corners of the business together, I think at the starting point really paints a big picture for how it's a role for everybody in the organization rather than just security.
That seems like such a logical place to start as far as, as a partner or as a vendor. You're coming in and you're trying to assist this customer. And I've been in technology now for about 20 years, and I haven't really met any customers that got a really good handle on their own network documentation. It's always growing. It's always shifting. People are always coming and going. You guys mentioned acquisition, then grabbing data from the newly acquired or the selling off. That's a big task. So when you guys come in and you start this exercise of gathering data, one of the things that I encounter quite frequently with the data protection conversation, and I'm a sales guy, so I'll frame it in the sense of a sales interaction. When you start talking about storing data, and you start talking about the different technologies and the logs and the amount of data, one of the pushbacks that, maybe pushback is a hard word, but maybe one of the speed bumps that we encounter is when we start talking about data retention policies. That is data that needs to live somewhere, whether that's on premise or in the cloud. That typically gets into a conversation of, well, if I got to put it in Azure, that means my consumption is going way up. Do you guys help the customer say, we've identified this data, and yes, you may need to hold it for X amount of time, but based on the classification, maybe we can move it here and save you some money, or maybe we can declassify it or reclassify it. Is that part of the training that goes in to educate the customer?
For sure, yeah. I think so. What a great example is of a dashboard is, for example, we split between Exchange and SharePoint, and it'll be an example of saying this is how much data you have. If you were to implement a retention policy and a deletion policy of X amount of years, this is how much data you could dispose of, right? So the very clear, painting the picture of, and sometimes what it does is probably the most interesting surface is that often clients will say, well, we do have retention and deletion in place. We actually have a 1 year retention and deletion policy in Exchange, and 3 to 5 years for retention deletion for SharePoint, and they can see that there's data going back to 2003, 2004, and they have no idea why this is the case. And what that does is, these are things like litigation holds when they did a migration, or users have freedom to place, in the legal team have freedom to place holds, and they're just holding everything because they're not aware of the implications of applying like litigation hold to mailbox or even an e-discovery hold to everything, right? So the most benefit I think they get from it is discovering where maybe their practices aren't working as efficiently as they should be. And there are anomalous or like one-off cases where there is like maybe one-off offenders or repeat offenders of not following their practices in the correct way, right?
And I think just to kind of add as well is I mean, you'd be surprised, guys. Some of our biggest clients kind of, maybe there's been a particular lawsuit or something, right, or a regulatory issue in the past where they just kind of panic, and as Amren says, they just apply a global legal hold on everybody, right? Because they just don't know what else to do. So they end up with huge amounts of over-retained data. But what we do see with the clients is this kind of evolution into kind of federated data ownership, so federating out into business units and making people accountable for the data. Where the gap is, I think, is those guys don't really know what to do next, right? They know they're accountable for this data. They know it's on hold for so long. But where we need to come in is say, well, look, let's do some analysis. Let's find out what that data is, right? And you guys have kind of terminology that's used in Purview, comes up a lot, and we often have to help clients understand the terminology. Is that we talk about data classification, the first thought of the client is, that's how I label it, right? So, oh, that's confidential. And they mistake the basis of classification. Classification is understanding, right, that's a credit card record, and that should sit here. And we've got some metadata about that. We've got some usage rules about how that's governed, how that's retained, how it's secured. A lot of that is missing in many organizations. So as Amren says, we've got the kind of environment scan product. The other thing that we do, leveraging your products straight out the box, like AIP scan, that technology gives us insights into on-premise. Seeing you guys really invest in improvements in the kind of Content Explorer and M365 discovery as well, so we can give clients that holistic view of, you've got SharePoint locations in this business unit that host credit card data. That's not a transactional part of the business. There shouldn't be payment card information there. What's going on? We can speak to the data owners about what's going on over there, right? That's a big thing. And we get a lot of surprises. We'll pull up the dashboards Aaron's talking about. Many of the curves are quite steady, but then you'll see some big anomaly. And the guys are like, oh, what's this guy? So it gets interesting.
I bet a lot of valuable data that you just reiterated there. That's awesome. Sorry, Michael.
No, you're fine. Well, excellent foreshadowing with the credit card data. So, there's obviously, Chris, you're over in the UK, Amren, you're here, but there's a lot of compliance regulatory demands now. And they change every day. How have you seen some of that play into your customer strategies around data security, information protection?
I think from my experience, the main focus of most of our clients is very reactive. Like it's because of a breach of some sort, or that they've been slapped with some requirement to implement something of some sort. So we generally tend to see it go one of two ways. One is it's IP or PII, for example, PCI, PII data, depending on what our client is. When we see it from a regulatory standpoint, typically the out-of-the-box solutions work quite well. We see users, they try it themselves. There's there's templates that you can relate to a certain regulation which work very well. So I think clients are quite well covered in kind of like from a regulatory standpoint, because of Microsoft have done a very good job of building out those identifiers and classifiers as they relate to certain regulatory requirements, so they can build out those templates quite easily. But I think it's building the layered controls around that it's not as easy as saying, okay, we know these are the data types that have to be looked for, but it's about associating the fact that, okay, we've identified that these are the types. How do we relate these to our our requirements or our data handling policies as specific to the organization. Chris, I don't know what you've seen on your side from a regulatory standpoint.
Just to add what you'd said about the kind of built-in detection capabilities, Amren, as well, and just for people listening, if they're not familiar, the kind of terminology of sensitive information types where we look and recognize patterns in data versus trainable classifiers. I think you guys, Microsoft, you guys have done some great jobs with the trainable classifiers. These are the kind of machine learning models that recognize data. And I think given you have that multi-tenant hosted model where you're able to drive your ML from people's data, you can quickly recognize for a brand new greenfield organization or an organization that's just adopted M365, the trainable classifier for legal affairs is going to light up, right? It's going to find legal affairs document. You don't need to do anything out of the box to see that that's going to light up, right? And draw your attention to it. So, using those sort of classifiers and getting that visibility early is pretty good. We get a lot of shocks from clients at that point when we start to say, do you realize you've got potentially legal agreements and those kind of things?
Well, one question before we move over to insider risk, which when we're talking about compliance and DLP, I think that's one area that can get a little bit more exciting just because it's talking about the end users versus bits and bytes. But just out of my own curiosity, you guys mentioned that you guys being Lighthouse started as a legal firm. And that's when I looked up your website, that's how you present yourself on the web. What is the correlation of legal services over into the two roles that you guys have? How do they mesh? How do they overlap? How do they disconnect?
Yeah, so you're right. So as well as a solutions partner for Microsoft, we're more traditionally an e-discovery services provider. So we're actually Microsoft's primary e-discovery services provider as well. But we have that side of the business, and we have another arm of the business, which is our global information governance advisory practice, which is the team in which Chris and I, we sit. So our advisory services department is made up of folks who come from legal and compliance background, like former litigators, in-house legal security professionals, previous practicing attorneys. Now these former security and legal professionals spend their time consulting on our clients on how to adapt and adopt the technology from a compliance and security standpoint. So that's that blend. Is we had a very strong legal focus when we were typically an e-discovery services provider, and then we saw the need for our clients to advise them on how they actually adopt this technology, what are the considerations from a compliance and legal standpoint, which was the birth of the advisory practice. And then as we started to get into that, there's obviously very natural overlap with data protection and a migration aspect as well. So that's how we branched out into the security space as well as just the legal and compliance space.
It's such a good fit. I mean, it's probably overdue. It's a lot of ways you can go on that, but from the folks that I've talked to on our broader team, and you guys mentioned how closely at the hip we're tied as partners. So it's an interesting story nonetheless. Michael, did you want to get into a little bit more of the insider risk and maybe try and spice up the conversation a little bit?
Yeah, we'll do some insider risk. Near and dear to my heart. I sold it back with a previous company, but it was agent based, so the customers would just roll their eyes when I said you need another agent. It's usually how that works. But yeah, I mean, this has become a big thing, right? When me and Greg were talking earlier, whether it's a malicious person or it's accidental, right? This has become huge. I think I told Greg the insiders have the keys to the kingdom. That's maybe not highly accurate, but right, we've got access that most people would not have, and that's kind of added to the data breaches, which we see almost every day. What are you guys seeing as some of the trends, some of the challenges within insider risk, and what are you guys doing or helping to recommend with organizations around it?
So I think, sorry, Amren.
Go. I don't know. You can go.
I think that the first thing is, we talked a bit about DLP. My view on this is you can't talk about, I'm going to say insider threat, right? Because I'm going to talk holistically across a whole organization, not about a product called insider risk management. I don't believe you can do insider risk without DLP, and I don't believe you can do DLP without insider risk or insider threat, right? I think that function has to consider everything. So that's the first thing. We see a lot with our bigger clients who have already got big established behavior analytics capabilities in their organization. That's where they bury the DLP as well, right? They bury it in those teams. And I think, for me, certainly as a professional working on your platform, I was super excited with the birth of insider risk, because I've worked with products like Exabeam and other products that do behavior analytics in the past, and thought, look, how can we get those insights, bring customers into M365, connect the DLP dots with the information protection dots. So we tend to find, we get engagements where people are interested in insider risk. But a lot of the conversation for me starts out at DLP, right? Where people have, firstly, they have that fear of switching on a DLP policy, because are they going to get alert fatigue? Have they got a model where they've got a central team supporting it and they're just going to get overwhelmed? So you can take a couple of approaches with that. You can put it in kind of audit mode or test mode. You still got to do that review. What I like about insider risk is it lets you close the tap a little bit, or open the tap a little bit, should I say, on DLP, and just have those thresholds where you start to see, right, this guy's done something over here, right? We're a bit unsure about that, but then this guy's persistently gone and started doing these other things, right? And now we're going to start to take note. This guy's got a higher risk score. We're going to start to take note of what this guy's doing. Potentially, we're going to shut that down. So, the insider threat is real. It's probably, I haven't got the stats in front of me, guys, but I did a presentation on this last year, and it's a very high percentage of data leakage and data losses caused by the insider threat. And that doesn't have to be malicious. That's inadvertent, clicking on the wrong thing, sending the wrong document to the wrong person, putting the wrong recipient in an email, those kind of things. So I think big thing for us is making customers aware that this is more than the malicious risk. It's more than, you've got a threat actor that's come in from external that wants to steal your crown jewels. No, this is the guy in the seat next to you that's clicked the wrong button, right? There's a big educational piece to get people to think differently, right?
Yeah.
And Amren, sorry, I jumped in before you were going to speak, so my apologies.
No, honestly, you're going to say exactly what I said. I think, that, like that thing we're talking about before was that that's telling that story of, the technology works in a certain flow. We often position it as, a journey to insider risk management, right? It's almost like the way those technologies are built, and with the way of Microsoft, when they released that, it was really exciting. It's my favorite piece of technology in the Purview stack by far, because it's like the all-encompassing tool within Purview. I think it's the one that really puts a wrapper around all of the previous data protection technologies, and really provides some context and that risk profile that it builds. It's really powerful, and I think it's probably one of the most powerful tool in the Purview tech stack. And then, as Chris said, with some of the recent updates they brought out, the adaptive protection is not just that flowing one way, right? So we'd always tell it as that waterfall effect of using those technologies, and the end goal of understanding what is the risk profile around a specific user. Now, as Chris is saying, we can kind of go the other way and actually apply those controls based on the risk that's calculated. So super powerful technology, and actually quite fun to talk about and demonstrate with the user activity and the timelines that you can show the associated the activities with each other.
I was really hoping you were going to say adaptive protection, so then I wouldn't. So thank you. That's awesome.
Yeah,
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
When you get into, and I haven't been in a deployment facing role in over a decade now, but when you start to assist customers with deployment, and you start looking at some of the graphs you're referring to, and you start to identify some of the trends in light of what we're talking about, when you actually start to identify users that may not have malicious intent, maybe are that problem child, to use that term, how does that conversation unfold with a customer? Is that hinted around? Is that treaded lightly? Or is that, hey, we identified XYZ and it's clearly an issue and it needs to be addressed? How do you go about having that delicate conversation?
So I think there's clients have a different approach from client to client, right? Some of the clients are concerned about anonymizing data so that we can't see who these individuals are, right? But we can at least draw their attention to that problem area. What we tend to find is we get into kind of use cases like you were saying there, Greg, right? It could be somebody who's not malicious, who's done a process for many years, who just hasn't evolved correctly with IT, right? They've just evolved slightly differently. They've gone on a different path. They don't get it anymore. And they're doing this repeated action every day where they're sending some data that they shouldn't be sending, right? And suddenly that's an outlier on a graph, or, we're seeing a signal for that. It's really, we're not focusing on that individual. We're focusing on that risk, trying to get into the client and look, what's your controls framework look like? What's your risk appetite for this kind of activity? And we think in most occasions where it's, inadvertent data leakage, you've probably got a very, very tight risk appetite on that. So it's about drawing that risk to people's attention and kind of quantifying that as well. We use the kind of common framework when we talk to customers about reputational damage, financial damage, but it's just about bringing that into kind of senior management layer, maybe even the C-level, to get those guys to understand that you've got to do more. You need to be more accountable to close these gaps down, right? Otherwise, you're going to be exposed to fines. You're going to be getting bad press and those kind of things. And it could just be because one poor little guy didn't quite know what he was doing, didn't quite evolve with IT, and just clicked the wrong buttons a few times. So, I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and I think as well, it's about making the clients aware of the fact that insider risk management is an exceptional tool for the identification of risk, right? But again, with the exception of adaptive protection, those specific policies, you can identify that risk, but then it's the onus is on the client then to say, okay, this is a gap clearly in our data protection strategy, and there needs to be a reaction to identifying that risk, right? We can't. Yes, you may identify when a user performs activity that presents a significant risk to the organization, but then you can't keep letting that happen, right? You need to act upon that before it becomes a frequent occurrence. So there's a huge element to that after identifying it to actually mitigate that risk as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic for a number of different reasons, but I can only imagine those graphs tell a story completely on their own when you start sucking over some of the data and you let it sit on the network for a little bit longer than it needs to, and typically numbers don't lie.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing that you guys are really kind of doing in that space at the minute that's exciting is just giving us more insights into different data, right? So I mentioned one of the platforms earlier, the kind of your traditional kind of user behavior analytics platforms. But for greenfield customers, but also now for customers that want to start to gain insights into data through M365, you guys are making that possible with connectors for insider risk as well, which is great. It's previously, when it was initially born, Michael, Greg, or possibly a slightly hard sell because you've got to tell customers, got to get the data there, right? You've got to get visibility of your data to be able to get these signals. You guys have done a great job on that, and I think what's really popular in our space is the HR connector. That's really popular. Almost every engagement we have, we do that. And that's about taking information about people's resignation date, people's actual leaving date, but also signals like this guy's been put on a performance review, or this guy's changed role, maybe that's a demotion. And we can combine that with signals then from communication compliance as well, where this guy says, oh, look, I've just been in a meeting with the boss. I hate this place. He's told me I've been demoted, right? And we can take those aggressive signals and combine that to build up that risk score. So the connectors are really exciting. The physical badging connectors there now as well. That allows us to see somebody's access has been revoked, but they've got access to a room. So what I'm really excited about is you guys just creating that flow of connectors for us, right? So we can start to say to customers, you don't need to use those old platforms anymore. Start to use the pane of glass through M365, through Purview, and use the connectors.
I think that's the overall message to not just the data protection conversation we're having, but just the overall architecture. It's every company out there is generating so much more data today than we were 5-10 years ago, certainly longer than that. But it's being able to use all of that data. We're collecting it for a reason. Sometimes we're just collecting it to collect it. But when you start to utilize some of these connectors, you actually can have actionable results with these connectors. And like you mentioned with the HR connector, that is invaluable type of data that you can then assign and truly act upon and strengthen your security posture. And the way you described it was perfect. I wanted to quickly ask before I forget, we've mentioned this engagement that you guys typically do on the entryway. What does the commitment to a customer look like from a time standpoint when you guys start to have this beginning engagement?
Yeah, so specifically for that environment scans piece, it's like I said, it's a very low lift, high reward kind of engagement. It can typically span anywhere between like 2 and 4 weeks, depending on the complexity of the environment and the scope of what we're looking for. So in terms of just the scans itself, it's a pretty short engagement, 2 to 4 weeks. At the end, the idea is that presenting back to the client around the information within their environment. That's usually 50-50 is kind of packaged within. That's a starting point of a much larger engagement where we'll perform, as Chris said, that deep understanding, what we call like a current state assessment, where we really do a deep dive into the understanding of what the environment looks like, the policy requirements, what their appetite is for adoption. Then we kind of move through to like a design phase where we really design out whether we're doing a POC or a pilot or a full-scale implementation. We really spend a lot of time building out that design, and then we kind of go into like the implementation and testing. So typically depending on technologies, we've had projects where we're doing the scans and implementing data classification, MIP, DLP, communications compliance, and insider risk, which can take 9 to 12 months. And then anything in between. So it could be 1 or 2 technologies. So, it can span from 4 to 6 weeks to almost a full year of engagement. Yeah.
I think, Greg, just you asked about the kind of number of seats or the size of the enterprises that we deal with. And a lot of the time we appreciate how challenging for the bigger seat organizations it can be to start to push big changes in technology, right? So we tend to, you might have a client that's got an appetite to just go all in, right? We want to do a 200 user seat pilot, and it's maybe a 500, 1,000 seat organization. That's a big deal for those guys, right? But they want to do it. Those bigger organizations, what we can do with those guys is say, look, we're going to deliver small chunks at high value so that you can prove back to your C-level that you are investing in the right technology and it is closing that risk gap, and really kind of present back on a regular basis through steer goes and frequent meetings during our engagements that we are closing that risk gap. But some of the clients we deal with, it's very challenging to make significant change quickly. So we have to kind of recognize that and deliver that slow, steady stream of pilots and recognize that success, kind of showcase the value that your products are bringing to these organizations.
Yeah, that's such a valid point. I mean, those other tools are in there for a reason. They were somebody's blood, sweat, and tears to get them there and fine tune them and get them there, the way they want them. And they've been using them for, X amount of days, months, years. And when you find that there's gaps in that, it's a tough conversation, and you put it very elegantly. We're getting close to approaching the hour, and we've got one question that we typically ask everybody at the end, and I'll ask it both to both of you today. Put on your thinking cap just for a minute, because it's kind of a fictional question. Let's see, Amren, I'll start with you. So
yeah.
If you were to take a role at your dream company, Acme Corporation, company of your choice, and you have been tasked with filling the seat of the CISO, what is the first engagement, deployment, the first action that you do in that new role?
I think I would start with obviously start understanding what technology is being used and what our data landscape looks like. I would look at really consolidating everything into the most holistic approach of like a data strategy program possible. So, I'm not saying I'm anti best of breed individual platforms, but I've just seen over the years how there are significant gaps caused by that difference in platforms, right? So I think consolidation of everything to mitigate any gaps, any risks, definitely from that information-centric approach that I was talking about. I think I would look to consolidate everything into, as few technologies as possible, while trying to maintain the fact that all requirements from a data handling standpoint are met, data protection standpoint are met.
No, that's an awesome answer. One that we have not heard yet either. So,
heard that one. Yeah.
Chris, same question
All
to
right.
you.
Well, I could always just cheat and give the same answer, right? But that'd spoil it, the session.
We'd have to fail you if you do that, I think.
Yeah. So I think for me, the idea of information security is that we're not here to stop the business, but we're here to ensure that the business produces its product, it hits its margins, and it does that within risk appetite, right? So for me, it's about building out an information security program that kind of really works with the business strategy. And what is the business? Where are we going over the next few years? What are the key risks? What is our risk appetite? And that's kind of where I start is, as Amren says, the big thing is getting visibility and gaining those insights. And that'd be my next activity is saying to the team, right, guys, I need to get insights. I need to look at, what near misses have we had in the past? What significant regulatory breaches have we had? What significant data breaches have we had in the past, and do that analysis. But I think the first thing for me is structuring that information protection program. And I think, I'm conscious it's a Microsoft podcast, guys. I'm not trying to give a Microsoft answer, honestly, but you guys have done a great job kind of aligning to the kind of correct way I would build out an information protection program, right? An information security program. You give the full end-to-end technology for me to be able to do that. You give me the insights, all the connectors around data for me to be able to do that. And I think, even small tools in M365 like Compliance Manager, Secure Score, that let me measure posture and risk against not just within my organization, but against my peers, against my competitors within my industry, seeing where I sit. So that's probably the thing for me is kind of how would I shape that program and align it to my technical roadmap and my strategy.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, we've got consolidation and we've got visibility, and I think any CISO would agree that you've got to have those as part of your strategy at certainly at the beginning, but as your security practice matures, those are two crucial components of having a tightened security posture. So before we just say goodbye and thank you, I did want to mention that Lighthouse and Microsoft are going to have a webinar coming up, and I don't know if we have the date firm yet, but once we have that date firm, we'll put some links in the description of these episodes. It is going to be similar to this conversation today as far as the topics that we talk about. So it's going to be a Purview type of webinar. So hopefully you can join us for that. But with that, Chris, Amren, I just wanted to say thank you for being so gracious with your time this afternoon. And Chris, I'm not sure what time it is there, but thank you for being up late with us. And hopefully we can have you guys back again, because this conversation went a lot quicker than I thought it would, being what I thought was going to be kind of a boring topic, but it ended up being a great conversation. So thank you.
Agree. I think there's more we could say, right, guys? So just right back at you. Thank you for having us today. Great hosts. Before we came into this, we checked out a bit of the podcast as well, and it's great what you guys are doing. So we'd love to come back. If there's another subject that you guys want to build out, let's do this again. But yeah, thank you for having us, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us, guys.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Enjoy your afternoon.
Appreciate it. You too.
You too.
Shall we play